Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Jason White and this is Jason's Weird Reads. Today I'm going to be telling you what my top fantasy books are. So before I begin, I just want to go on with a couple of disclaimers here. Actually, there's more than a couple. There's like five disclaimers. But let's get into those first, shall we? The majority of this list is epic fantasy books. But there are a couple of other subgenres that make their way into this list. The majority of fantasy that I have read have been epic fantasy, but as I said, there's a couple of other subgenres that are still fantasy that of books I've read that I absolutely loved, and so they made this list. Not all of these books, not all the books that are in a series that are on this list. I haven't read the entire series for. So what I mean by that is I probably have completed like a trilogy within the series as a whole. But I haven't read, there's some books in here that I haven't read the entire complete series of yet. Also, this is my list. You might not agree with the placement of some of the books I put on here, or maybe some of the books I did not put on here, and that's perfectly fine. But I just want you to remember that this is my list, not your list. If you don't like my list, that's fine, but you don't need to attack me for where I've put these books or what I left out. This list is also bound to change in the future because honestly, when I was making this list, there were a few surprises. This list is tiered, and so I was a little bit like, wow, that made that number? Okay, weird. But I know the more I read into fantasy and just the way my moods change, a year, 2 years down the road, this list might look very different. And also, one of these books, or series of books, I'm not very far into yet. I'm only close to the halfway point, and that might change later on. It might disappear completely from this list, or it might, who knows, it might make number one at some point. And lastly, for some of these books, I will, as I'm talking about them, some of them I read the synopsis, and these are more for the books that I've read like 10 years ago and I can't remember so well, but the ones that are more fresh and I do remember more of, those books I'm going to synopsize myself. Usually I just read the synopsis of books because honestly it's easier and people actually seem to like it. I get a lot of comments on my channel where I've read the synopsis of books and people are like, I like that you do that. So I've continued to do it, but this one I thought I'd switch it up just a little bit. Alright, so let's get into the books, shall we? Now, as I said, not all these books are series. There are a couple standalones here. For the majority, these are epic and also within a series of some sort. So, in at number 10, I have the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now, I am not done with this series. This is the series I was talking about, where I said I'm not very far into, but it might actually go up higher into the list later on once I'm done. I'm only on this book here, book number 4, House of Chains. And this book is, it's a real struggle. So let me tell you why this is at number 10. I'm not done yet with the Malazan, as I just mentioned. I'm only on this book here. It's one reason the series is so high on this list. Another reason is that this series as a whole so far has been a real struggle for me. There's been a lot of head scratching. There's been a lot of, why am I even reading this? But I continue to read it. So there's something there, obviously. And there's things that have happened in this series so far that have been absolutely mind-blowing. I keep hearing about how some of the really big fans of this series felt the exact same way I do when they were this far into the series. They were wondering, like, what's the point? So, but then when they finished the series, or the farther they got along, the more attached and the more they loved this series. So I'm just wondering what it's going to be like when, to say, I'm on book 8. How am I going to feel when I'm on book 8 of this series? Or after I've finished book 10, The Crippled God. So this series, it's really hard to describe exactly what it's about. This is the only one I don't think I'm going to really synopsize, because we're in book 4 and all I know is there's a lot of war. I really don't know exactly what the point of the series is just yet. So we're gonna continue. I'm like right at the halfway point. It's taken me a long time to read this book. I'm reading it with Crystal from Fiber Artsy, and we're taking our time, and I appreciate that we're taking our time with this series because there's a lot to soak in. And so yeah, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, that one falls into the 10th spot. All right, moving on to number 9. This is one that, actually, this is a part of a series, and I've only read the first book so far, and I don't know how closely linked these books are. This book sort of caters to what the rest of my channel is about, because it's kind of a weird entry, and that's Born by Jeff Vandermeer. This is definitely the odd one out of the bunch. It could be considered fantasy, science fiction, or even weird fiction, but I think it's actually, honestly, it's a mixture of all three of those genres. It follows a woman named Rachel who makes her living scavenging whatever useful items she can find. One day, while scavenging, she finds a creature fast asleep within the fur of a giant flying bear that haunts this town that she lives in. And the bear's name is Mord. At first, the creature doesn't look like much, but it continues to grow, as does Rachel's motherly attachment to Born. Born isn't an innocent creature, however. The more he grows, the more he needs to feed in order to sustain his growth. And we learn that Born is a genetic experiment escaped from the company. Ultimately, this is a story of motherhood, and it's wonderfully weird and heartbreaking. And it's also very difficult to explain without getting into too many spoilers and whatnot, but this book is like a dream. It's almost like a nightmare in parts. There's some very brutal things that happen in this book, but it's also kind of sweet. The mother, I guess, son relationship between Rachel and Born, as I said, was sweet, but it was also very heartbreaking. I highly recommend it. It's as I said, this book is out there. It's the weirdest entry on this list, but I couldn't help but add it because it's something else, as only Jeff Vandermeer can do, and it's an incredible read. In at number 8, this one might piss some people off because they're going to be like, "Why didn't you put it at number 1? This book belongs in number 1 spot only." But no, for me, this is number 8, and that is Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, everyone knows this book, or this series. Actually, it was meant to be one book, but they split it up into 3 books. I don't know if everyone knows that, but if you didn't know that, then now you do. And yeah, I might catch some flack for this being so low on the list, but this wasn't the first fantasy books that I ever read. It wasn't even close, actually. So while reading it back in the 90s and early 2000s, it didn't come across as the mind-blowing thing a lot of other fantasy readers felt that it was. But it's still here on this list. I couldn't not add it because I love this series. I love the characters. I love the storyline. I love following Frodo, Samuel, Pippin, Aragorn, Legolas the elf, and Gimli the dwarf, and of course Gandalf. The one thing I didn't like about this series, though, and one reason why it's, well, first of all, it's very tropey, but this was the first of its kind. So many other books. I don't think a lot of newer fantasy fans understand this so much, but a lot of the fantasy you read today, especially from the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, a lot of it was Tolkien-esque. Everybody wanted to create their own Lord of the Rings. But the one thing I didn't like about it was how the books were structured. It's very different. I mean, it was written a long time ago, I think in the 1940s. I could be wrong about that. But the structure of it is, like I said, very strange. Fellowship of the Ring was a little bit different, but if you're familiar with the story, once the 2 separate kind of groups of characters get separated, then the 2 Towers and the Return of the King have it so that one half of the book follows Sam and Frodo, and the second half of the book follows the rest of everyone else throughout whatever they're doing. So I honestly, I had trouble with that. I kind of like the back and forth that you typically get, like with, to say, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. Martin, where each chapter is a character, and the chapters are even named after that character. So you follow the good guy, or who could be perceived as the good guy, or you follow the bad guy or the good guy, and then it just switches between all the characters all throughout the Westeros continent, and I prefer that, honestly, because then you're not just stuck reading one thing for like 300-400 pages. You get to bounce around a little bit and get a variety. That's my biggest complaint about Lord of the Rings. However, it's a brilliant series. It really sparked off a genre all to its own, and it definitely deserves to be on my list because I did read the series. I admit I started reading the series when the movies came out way back in like the 2000s, and I was captivated. I absolutely loved reading them. All right, in at number 7 is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is one of the most unique magical systems I have ever read. If you ever heard anyone on BookTube talk about the Mistborn series, this is the original first trilogy that I'm talking about, of course. I have all 3 of those books in hardcover from their original publication. For some reason, I can't find book number 1. It's somewhere in storage, but I do have book 3 here that I sort of wanted to show off. I have book 2. It's just behind me here, but I just wanted to pull out book 3 because I think the cover is neat, but there's too much glare. I don't think you can see it properly. As I was saying before I interrupted myself, Mistborn has one of the most unique magical systems ever created, and I'm not alone in thinking so. It involves its practitioners called allomancers. They can metabolize flakes of different kinds of metal and use it to enhance their abilities. Each metal has its own unique effect, and allomancers themselves have unique specialized talents. Here is a quick synopsis from the first book, The Final Empire, because the premise is so unique, and it's been about 10 years or more since I've read it. So here's the synopsis. For 1,000 years the ash fell and no flowers bloomed. For 1,000 years the Ska slaved in misery and lived in fear. For 1,000 years the Lord Ruler, the sliver of infinity, reigned with absolute power and ultimate terror, divinely invincible. Then, when hope was so long lost that not even its memory remained, a terribly scarred, heartbroken half-Ska rediscovered it in the depths of the Lord Ruler's most hellish prison. Kelsier snapped and found in himself the powers of a Mistborn. A brilliant thief and natural leader, he turned his talents to the ultimate caper, with the Lord Ruler himself as the mark. Kelsier recruited the underworld's elite and smartest and most trustworthy allomancers, each of whom shares one of his many powers, and all of whom relish a high-stakes challenge. Then Kelsier reveals his ultimate dream, not just the greatest heist in history, but the downfall of the divine despot. But even with the best criminal crew ever assembled, Kelsier's plan looks more like the ultimate long shot, until luck brings a ragged girl named Vin into his life. Like him, she's a half-Ska orphan, but she's lived a much harsher life. Vin has learned to expect betrayal from everyone she meets. She will have to learn to trust if Kel is to help her master powers of which she has never dreamed. So I read the Mistborn trilogy about 12 years ago, and I really enjoyed it. One thing I really enjoyed about these books is just how original the storytelling is, and all the world building that goes into it. Master Sanderson, Brandon Sanderson is a master of doing this sort of thing, and obviously I don't need to tell you this. You probably heard it already. All right, moving on to number 6. At number 6, I have the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. Now, I read this one about around the same time as Mistborn. I read it in August of 2011. So here is the series synopsis. Born on the wrong side of the sheets, Fitz, son of chivalry Farseer, is a royal bastard cast out into the world, friendless and lonely. His only his magical link with animals, the art known as the wit, gives him solace and companionship. But the wit, if used too often, is a perilous magic, and one abhorred by the nobility. So when Fitz is finally adopted into royal household, he must give up his old ways and embrace a new life of weaponry, scribing, courtly manners, and how to kill a man secretly, as he trains to become a royal assassin. These books are basically, they're a character study into Fitz's growth. It's a coming of age series because he's a child when we first meet him, and he's an adult by the end of the third book. But this series holds Robin Hobb's hypnotic prose that everyone, including myself, love. Maybe not everyone, but the majority of people who read Robin Hobb kind of fall into her prose because I wouldn't say she writes purple prose. Not even a little bit. I think her prose is just simply beautiful, and it really pulls you in, and it hypnotizes you. When you're reading Robin Hobb prose, you just know who you're reading, and you appreciate it. At least I do. And she's very good at breaking readers' hearts. She is well known for this. Fitz does not have a good time throughout these books. There is no Mary Sue whatsoever going on in these books. Now, I also like to mention, I've only read one book in this series so far. I read it a couple years ago, but Shaman's Crossing, book 1 of the Soldier Sun trilogy, is also really good. It has that Robin Hobb feel to it, although when she wrote these, I don't think she was writing as Robin Hobb. I can't remember what name she used, but these books are really good too. So, number 6, Farseer by Robin Hobb. In at number 5 is another standalone that I have, and that is American Gods by Neil Gaiman. I read this book a lot. I used to have the box of the CDs for the audiobook, and I had this very mundane night job. It's about 15 years ago, and I just listened to this on repeat. I just continuously listened to it on my Discman. If you remember those little portable CD players that you plug in your earphones, what we all use our cell phones now for. But I listened to it at least 4 or 5 times, and I read the book with my eyes at least once, maybe twice. Honestly, I don't know why this book isn't at number 1. I guess it's because the other books, despite the fact that I didn't read them as much as this book, made just a bit more of an impression on me, maybe because the worlds are bigger. I don't know. But I read this book a lot, and I really enjoyed also the second book in this, what is sort of a series, Anansi Boys. Here's the synopsis for American Gods. Days before his release from prison, Shadow's wife, Laura, dies in a mysterious car crash. Numbly, he makes his way back home. On the plane, he encounters the enigmatic Mr. Wednesday, who claims to be a refugee from a distant war, a former god and the king of America. Together, they embark on a profoundly strange journey across the heart of the USA, while all around them, a storm of preternatural and epic proportions threatens to break. And this is, of course, a war between all the gods. This book is sort of takes the idea of the way we used to worship everything, or at least give a god to everything, like fertility, the god of fertility, or growing crops. There was a god for that, and also gods from different countries and different religions. All the gods that you can ever think of probably make an appearance in this book. It's a very thick book, and it's also very fun. I at least enjoyed it. I love Neil Gaiman. And I kind of wish Neil Gaiman, although I forget who narrated the I want to say George Guidall, but I'm not too sure if that's who it was. But I I liked his narration. I thought it fit perfectly for the book. That's what I thought anyway. But I would have really loved it if Neil Gaiman himself narrated it, because I could honestly, I've said this quite a few times, but I could seriously listen to Neil Gaiman read a phone book, because he just has this weird hypnotic way about narrating his own stories, and probably all stories. So that's number 5, American Gods by Neil Gaiman. In at number 4, I have Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. My history with the Wheel of Time is long and somewhat arduous. I started reading these books back when there was only maybe 3 or 4 of the books published. This is like 1995, 96. And I was reading it with a friend of mine at the time, and I got kind of tired of reading it, honestly, back then. My friend was right into it. He was like encouraging me to continue with the series. I finished around book 3, and I was like, I'm done. But then I picked it up again somewhere in the 2000s. I think it was around 2008, 2009, and I made it all the way to like book 6. Again, I just got kind of bored, and I stopped. And then 3 years ago, I think now, 3 years ago, on my channel here, I decided that I was going to tackle the entire series and finish it. And I did. I read books 1 to 3 for the 3rd time, and then books 4 to 6 for the 2nd time, and then I finished off the series for the 1st time. And it was quite the journey. If you've only read the first book, Eye of the World, that book is very trope heavy. I mean, the whole series is kind of trope heavy, but the first book especially, because it's very Tolkien-esque. From my understanding, Robert Jordan wanted to write this series and take the whole Tolkien idea of having a hero and flipping it, turning it completely on its head. And he did that. He subverted the tropes, but you don't really get that sense. Well, the 2nd book starts to do that, but the farther you get, the more different this series becomes from Tolkien. By the end of the Wheel of Time, there is absolutely nothing even... You can't compare it to Tolkien at all. The first book, all you can do is compare it to Tolkien. The second half of the series, I would say, it looks nothing at all like Lord of the Rings. So, the synopsis. A chosen one trope that follows a small group of friends, Rand, Nynaeve, Egwene, Mat, and Perrin. They are taken from their village, Edmund's Field, by the Aes Sedai Moraine and her warder, Lan Mandegarin, I think I pronounced that right, after an organized attack by Trollocs and a Myrddraal. We then follow these characters as we learn who is the chosen one, in this case the Dragon Reborn, of the prophecy within the series, and who will help them save the world from the Dark One, Shaitan, or lead it to its utter destruction. This is the one thing that's really, really cool about this book, or this series, is it's full of cultural diversity and many political intrigues. And also, this series is massive. There's so much that goes on, especially after book 3. Once book 4 hits, book 4 is a bit of a game changer for the series. And I would say that book 4 becomes a staple of what the rest of the series is. So be prepared for that if you haven't read these books. Book 4 is a really big changer, and so is book 5 in a sense. Book 5 is really what becomes sort of like the blueprint for the rest of the series. First 3 books are almost like the same book told over and over again, and that you have like all the characters together, they get separated, and then they get back together again. But there's obviously very many different things that happen that make each of those first 3 books different from one another. It's just sort of the structure that takes place that seems very familiar. So I absolutely love these books. I'm going to have to read the series again at some point, because honestly, the last 4 or 5 books have become somewhat blurry in my memory, because there's so many characters. My God, there's so many characters. You wouldn't think so reading the first book or the first 3 books, but the character list gets huge, and it's honestly, it's a little difficult to keep track of them all. So yeah, maybe a reread in the future is in store. I don't know. We'll see. But in at number 4 is Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. We're getting there. Number 3 on this list. Actually, I would say these next two are probably what you might figure would be on this list. But number 1 is a bit of a surprise. Anyways, the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie makes my 3rd spot. This series was a game changer for me in reading fantasy and for a lot of people. These books are brutal. I've read the first trilogy, the First Law trilogy, and I absolutely adored them. My God, did I love these books. The first trilogy, starting with the Blade itself, follows Logan Ninefingers, Captain Jazal Dan Luthar, Inquisitor Glokta, and the Wizard Baez. The books are character-based, more so than plot-based, which is very important because a lot of fantasy has a very strong plot structure. It's very much a hero's journey type of writing style within, story structure. But these books take a very big turn away from that. These are character studies almost only. And it's turned some people off from reading them. So, as I said, I think it's important to know that. Instead, readers are challenged to witness the main characters, and from my memory, I would say especially Logan and Glokta, as they live their violent lives, because both these two characters live very violent lives, and how they changed throughout battles, war, and personal failures. Because there's a lot of that too, personal failures. It's very unique and brutal. I remember having so much fun with this series. And I need to reread it because I want to continue on. I've read a couple of the standalones. Actually, I think it's only one standalone, Best Served Cold. But I haven't read any of the others because I went through a huge, very long fantasy slump. I want to reread the trilogy of these the first trilogy of these books, and then go on and finish all of the rest of the books because I hear that they're just as good as the first 3. Alright, so we have made it down to number 2. Number 2, I have talked about this book, or this series, but not extensively, and these books were another game changer. They absolutely blew my mind. Of course, I'm talking about A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. I am indeed one of those snobs who hate it when people refer to the books as a Game of Thrones. I hate that. I think it's because I was reading A Song of Ice and Fire way back in like 1995, 96. And I kept up with the series pretty much, honestly. I've read to where it's at. I don't know, as everyone else doesn't know, I don't know if the series is ever going to be completed. But I hope so, because it's awesome, especially the first 3 books. All right, let's get into what I have written here. Winter is coming and war is brewing. When the king of Westeros falls in a hunting accident, the continent is separated into 5 factions, all battling to become the king of the continent. So basically the king dies, and there's like 5 separate people who think that they have the right to the throne, but of course there's only one who can be king, and so they all go to war. Everyone chooses a side basically, because within the continent there's different sort of like countries or whatever, and they all fight, and it gets to be one hell of a brutal war. If I were to redo this list at another point in time, even just last year or 6 months ago, this series probably would have made number 1 because of how brutal and nasty it is, and what George R.R. Martin is able to do with his characters. Honestly, one of my favorite things about these books are the characters. I love how Martin plays with our emotions. He's continuously manipulating us, making us hate a character. I mean, there's some characters in this book I've hated more than anything I've hated in real life. But then some of these characters that you hate, he flips around and makes you kind of love them. And that to me takes a master. How does he do it? He doesn't do it obviously. You're just following this character along, regardless if you like them or not. In fact, one of the characters you hate because in the very first book he does something awful, but then by the end of the fifth book you're rooting for him, despite the fact that he did this horrible thing in the first book. Martin also has this terrible ability to shock you. I have never been as shocked or surprised as Martin has made me in these books. And also, some of these books, like this one here, the end of this book pissed me off. Like, no one's business. I was so angry at the end of this book. Anyone who's read this book knows what happens at the end of this book. And I was just like, really? Really? My God. All right, so, yeah. A lot of people talk about how the first three books are absolutely best, and the fourth and fifth book are not so good. I would agree with them to a point. I really enjoyed the fourth and fifth book, but they don't have the same oh my godness that the first three books have. The first three books are some of the most brutal. I mean, it's not just that they're brutal. George R.R. Martin has this strange ability of showing what a war-torn continent could be like. He shows not just the war itself, but he shows what happens to the rest of the country that isn't necessarily on the front lines. He shows the struggles that the people go through. He has bodies floating down the river where there's a battle somewhere nearby. It's just things like that are, honestly, they're kind of awesome to read about, because he's taking things that have happened in real life, in history, that are happening even now, and he's showing you truth through this fantasy world. So Song of Ice and Fire, I would say, made one of the biggest staples onto my young mind, or younger mind, I should say. The first three books are among the best I've ever read. They're absolutely brilliant and mind-blowing, and I still enjoyed the rest of the series, and I do have a glimmer of hope that the series will be finished at some point, but I guess we'll have to see. So, Song of Ice and Fire, that makes my number 2 spot. Now, number 1 here, you're not going to no, I've never talked about these books, and what kind of sparked these books as being number 1 was a huge reminder of them. These were my first adult fantasy books that I ever read. And of course I'm talking about the Rift War cycle. I should say Rift War saga, because I've only read 2 series within this 29 book epic. And so approximately 8 books of this series I've read. I'm hoping to read the rest. And the first book is Magician Apprentice. It's actually Magician Apprentice and Magician Master were supposed to be one book, but they were so big that the publisher decided to split them into 2. Ultimately, though, when you look at the page count, there are books now, like what Brandon Sanderson is writing, that are so much thicker than what these first 2 books probably would have been. This probably would have clocked in maybe just over 1,000 pages. I don't know. It's not that thick these days, but back in the 80s, it was a different story altogether. This is my copy that I was reading in my, I guess, 20s? When I was in my teens, maybe? I remember I've never really been a D&D player, and none of my friends were, but we were curious about it, so we tried making our own game, and it was a vampire D&D game that we were trying to play, and it didn't really work out all that well, to be honest with you. But we of course got onto the topic of D&D and fantasy, and I was talking to my friend, and I was saying, I wanted to read more fantasy, but at the time it seemed like a fairly big list. It's bigger now, much bigger. but I didn't know where to start. And he's like, dude, read these books. And so I read them, and I absolutely fell in love. So these books are in the #1 spot because of purely, honestly, nostalgia. The way these books made me feel while I was reading them, it was pure magic, honestly. And that's not a pun. But nostalgia is a very powerful thing. Also, and what reminded me of these books and made me start thinking about them again is that they're going to adapt them into a TV series. And I'm all for that. I'm totally for that. And I'm hoping, actually, to do what I did with The Wheel of Time and read this series again. And I'm not too sure when I'm going to do that, or if I even will. But I want to reread these books just to see if they hold up. And you'll probably see these books sink because there are some flaws within this book. Like, women are not represented well in at least the first series here. In that there's no woman who's a hero in the story. They're all sort of side characters, and they all perform like, typical womanly duties. So let's get into what these books are about just a little bit. The Rift War Saga. In the Rift War Saga, we follow Pug, an orphan child destined for greatness as he grows up and becomes a powerful, if not the most powerful, magician within the land of Midkemia. Middle Ages, which is Midkemia is based off Middle Ages European based culture. Well, the Surani, which is an Asian-based culture, invades the land using large portals, what's known as rifts. Hence the Rift War. These rifts are opened by magicians, and so through the first 4 books of the Rift War Saga, you have this war happening between 2 pretty powerful nations. And as the series continues, from my understanding, because I also read the Serpent War Saga, rifts get to be used by other types of creatures, aliens to Midkemia world, I believe, if I remember correctly. It's been like 20 years or more since I read these books. Another thing to remember is that Magician Apprentice is written, I think, in the mid-'80s, and it kind of shows a lot of people say these books didn't age very well, and that is within the writing itself. It's very classic fantasy. Although there are, just with my synopsis there are some things that are somewhat original to the series, like adopting an Asian culture. I don't know if I said Japanese. No, I said Asian. So I think Raymond E. Feist, he adopted Asian cultures, but I think he focused primarily on Japan. I could be wrong about that. And I don't know how well that would work in today's standards. People might think that he did it poorly, but maybe he did it okay. I mean, he didn't steal. He's not saying that these are Asians. He just used a lot of their cultures. So I'm interested in seeing again how he did that and how well it worked in today's world anyway. These books, honestly, man, they were a magical experience, and they really boosted me into the whole fantasy, especially epic fantasy genre, and I basically never looked back. I kind of wish that I continued reading those books, but of course I needed to explore other worlds, and I've never, after the Serpent War Saga, which I read in actually a little bit later on, I think I read those in the aughts, the 2000s, I should have kept going, but I didn't. Honestly, I didn't even know he was still reading or writing within the Midkemia world, or if he did. I don't know. It seems like a lot of people are kind of about some of those later books, but if I ever do finish the series at all, like the series proper, all the trilogies and quadrilogies within the series proper, maybe I'll have something to say in regards to what those books are like. And it would be interesting to see how far down the series goes in the list, if it even disappears completely, or if it comes back and stays at #1. I guess we shall see if I ever do get to reading it again. Alright, so we have made it this far. That is my top 10 list of fantasy books. Fantasy isn't something I read often, but I want to read a little more consistently, along with science fiction. So please tell me what you thought of my list. If you're up to it, tell me what your favorite fantasy books are. Just list them down there in the darkness. And if you have made it this far, leave me a little wizard emoticon down there in the comments as well. Thank you for watching. Keep being safe, keep being creative, and I'll catch you guys in the next bookish video.